Hello, everyone, and welcome for part two. Last week, there were some unanswered questions, and I only got to the first one. I couldn't get the remaining four, so I may be able to do those next week. The question that I did manage to get copied dealt with quotes from DeSantis and not finding them online. Here's what I found. It's a total of 6 slides. Here's a Washington Post article. DeSantis doubles down on claim that some blacks benefited from slavery. Vanity Fair, Ron DeSantis, slavery was a good thing. Curriculum weirdly unpopular among GOP hopefuls. What I did is I just typed in Ron DeSantis quotes on slavery and got these results. Here's BU Today. Historians weigh in on Ron DeSantis' slavery remarks and his defense of Florida's controversial social studies curriculum. AP, Associated Press, DeSantis defending new slavery teachings. Civil rights leaders see a pattern of policy violence. And from Fox News, DeSantis defends history curriculum on NBC. Slaves develop skills in spite of slavery, not because of it. And on YouTube, there's some videos that you could watch, interviews from NBC News, such as the one on the lower left there. So that's what I found. So there's lots of evidence of his remarks concerning slavery and what can and cannot be said in Florida curriculum. Now let's get to our Jefferson lecture. We got through 120 slides last week, and this week we're going to begin with an outline of Jefferson's presidency. There's 8 major items in this outline. They are the 8 biggies of the Jefferson administration, which lasted from 1801 to 1809, total of 8 years. We'll discuss each of these in much larger detail throughout the course of these lectures. First major item is shipping and trade. Southern states were super dependent on trade. They had a gigantic crop, could not be used totally within the United States. So they, and England did a tremendous amount of clothing manufacturing. So they needed to get this product out. Trading with other countries was vital importance to the South. The situation in the North, which was a manufacturing economy, not just simply an agricultural one. So it did a lot of manufacturing. So they weren't nearly as desperate for trade. They were able to make goods that they needed locally. Barbary pirates got an enlarged map of the Mediterranean Sea, which is where these Barbary pirates were operating. I'll show you that in the next slide. The Barbary pirates were made up of Muslims, And they captured literally thousands of ships that were trading throughout the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean at this time was really looked at as the great trading area. And it had all the northern African countries and the southern European countries, and even northern European countries were trading throughout the Mediterranean Sea. Not only did they capture the goods that were on board ships of other countries, but they also held the crews for ransom, held the ships for ransom, stole the goods that were on board the ship, and sold them throughout North Africa. Here's the map of the area there. In the area in green is the Ottoman Empire. It was a Muslim empire. In Southern Europe, its boundary was just 60 miles from Vienna, Austria. And it controlled, as you can see here, all of North Africa. Probably the most famous city in North Africa is where the red arrow is pointing, Tripoli. That became part of the Marine fight song. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. This is what they're talking about, is defending U.S. ships against these Barbary pirates. British trade policy. Britain wanted to control trade. They were expanding their empire all around the world. Literally, the sun did not set on the British Empire by the time it got to be later into the 1800s. They wanted to say, here's what you can and can't trade. We're the only people that can trade certain items. The rest of you can trade these items. So some things were banned. Some things the British, with their gigantic navy and holdings all around the world, said, we have exclusive rights to trade these items. No one else can trade them. It wasn't until about the 1840s that trade opened up, became what we call free trade, and the British backed off a bit. From the Louisiana Purchase is another major item in the Jefferson administration. This purchase was made from the country of France, which controlled the Mississippi River and a tremendous amount of land west of the Mississippi River, up very near to the Rocky Mountains. This purchase doubled the size of the United States. The United States then became concerned, number one, lots of Indian nations and Indian tribal groups, Native Americans within this area. You want to settle people from the U.S., you've got to move a lot of those Native Americans out of their settled lands or their nomadic areas that they traveled. Take a look at the larger map. I've drawn a black line near the left top, runs from Lake of the Woods, Minnesota to the Pacific Ocean. That's the 49th parallel. It is the border that was finally agreed upon between Canada and the United States. You can see just a small portion of the Louisiana Purchase is north of that line and ended up becoming a part of Canada. Now, this is the 49th parallel. You get up into the 1840s and 50s, and people are proclaiming that the United States should own all the land. 54 degrees, 40 minutes latitude. This black line is 49 degrees. It's more than another 5 degrees northward. Tremendous amount of land, all the way up into Alaska. But we agreed with Britain that this Canadian border would fall along the 49th parallel. And then you can see this gigantic Louisiana Purchase. United States paid about $15 million for it. But anyway, more on that when we go in depth on Jefferson's administration. And of course, the Lewis and Clark expedition also we'll talk about in great depth that explored this territory. Native American tribal removal. So Native Americans being removed from their lands was another major event during the Jefferson administration. U.S. wants to settle certain lands, so people are forcibly migrated further westward. Here's a painting of such a forced migration. One of these migrations had about 16,000 people on it. 4,000 died en route, 25%. So these were deadly, part of the genocide that occurred as the United States moved westward, genocide against the Native American groups. And again, greater depth on that later. The Aaron Burr trial, excuse me. This Louisiana territory that had been opened up, Burr went out into that area. What's he doing out there? And the suspicion was he's going to try to create a new nation. He had some finances that he'd gained from other people who saw themselves as maybe benefiting from a separate nation in what today is the Western United States, or even into the Louisiana Purchase. When Burr returned from the area, he was forced to stand trial. We'll talk about that in greater depth later. The Embargo Act. An embargo act, or an embargo, is a ban of some sort. And in this case, this action by Congress with Jefferson's support placed a ban on trade with Britain. Jefferson was a big supporter of France. France had had a revolution after the U.S. did. Jefferson had been a ambassador to France under the Articles of Confederation in the 1880s, and he really loved France and loved their wines and food, etc. So he was opposed to the United States siding with Britain. Lots of other people said, hey, United States should side with Britain because they do lots of trading. What's France got? You know, for Jefferson, it was a philosophical thing. They have a revolution. We have a revolution. They're the ones we should be siding with. This was just about the worst action taken by Jefferson during his presidency. Slave imports were banned. Now, sounds great. Oh, well, we're not going to be capturing slaves in Africa and hauling them to the United States anymore. But this was not a positive action. It was something that aided in the increase of wealth among people in Jefferson's class. Now, the only way you could get slaves wasn't from Africa and from internal sales from big slave owners. It was now big slave owners were the only way that you could buy slaves. This aided people like Jefferson, who now would sell a couple slaves to some farmer with a few acres who needed some slaves. So large slave owners could sell off their excesses. Excuse me. Jefferson is considered to be a Renaissance man. Leonardo da Vinci drew this picture at the bottom, so shows a man in full arms out, legs stretched, multiple arms, etc. We have lots of places we can go now church was losing power. Jefferson was a part of this movement. He was a Renaissance man. So thinking broadly is one of the conditions of being a Renaissance person. The Renaissance was full of people who were great thinkers. Jefferson was such a person. And let's take a look at some of the things Jefferson was interested in, and this is typical of Renaissance thinking, is broad area of interest. He was a planter. Of course, he didn't physically plant anything, but he decided what would and wouldn't be planted and then had slaves do the actual work. He was also certified as an attorney. He was an outstanding musician. He played a violin, and his daughter played with him frequently. He was an author. Most famously, he rewrote the first 5 books of the New Testament, taking out things he didn't like, removing them, and we'll talk about that in more detail later. He was a politician, ambassador to France, president of the United States. He was vice president under John Adams, also a mathematician. He was a horticulturalist. He grew lots of interesting plants and flowers, frequently that were just for enjoyment, not for food. He was a mechanical engineer, spent quite a bit of time designing some very interesting things. Philologist, he knew half a dozen different languages, and we'll discuss that. He's also an architect, built buildings at the University of Virginia, designed them, designed his own home, Monticello, and he was an archaeologist. So let's take a look at these items. Philosophy and religion. Let's look at that as first a part of Jefferson's Renaissance identity. I don't know why I keep getting this slide anyway. He believed in separation of church and state. He wanted, on government property, he wanted all religious practices banned, and he did that. I mean, today now we have chaplains in the Congress, but if Jefferson had held up with his views, there would be no prayer allowed, no religious meetings in any government buildings or any government properties. He also founded the American Philosophical Society. Here's a famous kind of political cartoon describing what Renaissance people wanted. A huge, gigantic wall made out of a substantial substance, with the church on one side and the state on the other side, and no interference, no communication even between the two. Erecting the wall of separation between church and state is absolutely essential in a free society, according to Jefferson. Throughout much of history up until the Renaissance began in the 1500s, the church had sided with the ruling class, which generally included a king and nobility, lords, etc. And these people together supported each other. So you had the nobility saying, don't criticize the church. You had the church saying, the king serves because he was appointed by God. It's the divine right of kings. You must do what the king says, etc. Jefferson and the Renaissance said, we need to end all of that stuff. We need church and state separated. churches shouldn't be in control of people's lives. Deism or deists were the people that were common during the founding of the United States. Jefferson was among them. Deists believe in God, but they did not believe in the divinity of Christ. This describes what most of Jefferson's friends were like. Lots of people say Jefferson was a deist, not believing in the divinity of Christ. A few people say that he was an atheist. I would tend toward saying that from Jefferson's demeanor, the rules that he made, the things that he wrote, etc., that he was an atheist. Deism is the belief that a higher power created the world, but God then did not interfere with the natural law that he had created, nor did he perform miracles. People, as a result, since God is not involved in our lives, only in our creation, people have to rely on logic and reason, not on religious traditions, not on the Bible. Famous deists from history here, Napoleon Bonaparte, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, according to many, probably most, claiming Jefferson to be a deist. God created the universe, then abandoned it. Just the opposite of today as beliefs that God is very closely involved in the lives of individuals and what's happening on the earth, etc. These deists believed in a God separated from it all. This is Thomas Paine, famous quote. The deist needs none of those tricks and shows called miracles to confirm his faith. For what can be a greater miracle than the creation itself and his own existence? This is a fitting definition of deism from one of the deists from the period, Thomas Paine. And again, most of Jefferson's friends were deists. Jefferson was baptized. He was raised as an Episcopalian in the Episcopalian Church, but he was baptized as an infant when he really had no choice in the matter. Some religious groups do not baptize until later in life when they feel that the person has such a choice. Reading of philosophers for Jefferson is what separated him from traditional religious groups and from the traditions of religion. Many say ban philosophers. So there was this conflict. Jefferson believed in philosophers. Many within the church said, no, all you need is the Bible. Here are some philosophers, Nietzsche on the left, top right, Descartes, Spinoza. Descartes' most famous for his phrase, I think, therefore I am. In Latin, it is cogito ergo sum. So I think it's because humans have the ability to think. That's why they exist. I think, therefore I am. Here's a shocking picture of Descartes when he realized that people who don't think also exist. Jefferson liked Epicureanism. Epicureanism has its origins in ancient Greece, and it's named for Epicurus, who you see a statue of there in the graphic. Hedonism is a word that means pleasure. And the Epicureans felt that pleasure was a very good thing, hedonism, and that hedonism is of the highest order. So the seeking of pleasure. Now, as a 20th century person or a 21st century person, you probably thought this meant physical pleasure, but it didn't, not to the ancient Greeks. It meant mental pleasure. Freedom from anxiety is pleasurable. Negative mental concerns, that's no good. Epicurus, he says, life is good, make sure to enjoy it. So that's what they're talking about when the ancient Greeks, when they discuss hedonism. The opposite of Epicureanism is Stoicism. Stoicism is you got to endure the pain. Life can be difficult. There's hardship. There's lots of indifference. Why am I? What am I doing? What does it matter? Etc. That's Stoicism. Here's a political cartoon. Rest in peace. Zeno the philosopher, dead, but so what? And the caption is, he was a stoic. There's another political cartoon. The sign in the upper right, the journey to enlightenment. And the caption is, are we there yet? The unexamined life combined with an MBA is highly marketable. News gets out that the Stoics' annual party has been canceled. Here's 3 Stoics saying, never mind, can't be helped, mustn't grumble, eh? Jefferson was an Epicurean, so gain mental pleasure. Here's a rare image of Jefferson smiling. One of the reasons we seldom see people during this time period smiling is because there wasn't much that could be done about bad teeth. Almost everybody needed dental work. So people would always want their mouths shut when they were painted, or even into the 1840s, photography invented in the 1839s. It's just, you didn't want to show your teeth. Also, once photography was invented, the exposure time was lengthy, and you couldn't hold a smile that long either. So you'd just have your mouth shut. Our first Christian president was Andrew Jackson. He was the 7th president. Many people have stated to me that we've always had Christian presidents. That just simply is not the case. First 6 presidents, there were 4 were deists: Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. 2 were Unitarians, also not believing in the divinity of Christ. They were John Adams and John Quincy Adams, both of them buried in a Unitarian church in Massachusetts. There was a 3rd Unitarian president from 1909 to 1913. That was William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft many times made statements that he did not believe in the divinity of Christ. So there have been at least 7 presidents who were not Christians. Maybe more, but they never said so, and they even maybe said other things. Personal demeanor of Jefferson. What was this guy like? Strange. He was a reluctant speaker. Why? Jefferson had a lisp, and he had a stutter also. A lisp is where you have trouble saying S's and Z sounds. And a stutter is where you can't get an entire word out. Hello, like that. So what's stuttering? It's an interruption in the flow of speech, and it can happen in different ways. You can repeat a sound. Can I have a biscuit? You can repeat words. My name is John. Or you can prolong the first letter of words. Socks and shoes. Or you can block things. What is that? Frequently, a person stutters, can look kind of tense in the process of trying to get the word out. They're struggling to speak, and that sends an impression to the people who are listening to them. And frequently, people listening to stutterers interrupt by saying the word for them. Stutterers are taught that even if somebody interrupts and says the word, you keep attempting until you get it out. Presidents had spoken the State of the Union messages. A State of the Union message is delivered to Congress annually. It's almost always been done in January. Ronald Reagan delayed one of his until March, just wasn't ready to do it. But at any rate, any president does this annually. Now, Washington did 8 of them. John Adams did 4 of them. Jefferson comes along with a stutter. He says, I'm not going to deliver any speeches, let alone to Congress. So he wrote out his State of the Union messages and then sent written reports during his 8 years as president. And he set a standard as a result of that. For the next 113 years, presidents submitted written speeches to Congress. They did not go to Congress and speak the State of the Union. The guy that broke that tradition in 1913 was Woodrow Wilson, pictured here, delivering the first vocal, verbal State of the Union message since the year 1800. This is Demosthenes, Roman senator. He stuttered, and he wanted to get rid of the stutter. He ended up becoming one of Rome's great orators. He didn't know what to do, but he got the idea that maybe if I put a flat rock on my tongue, it would stop this stuff from happening. So he went down to the seashore and he looked for certain rocks, placed them on his tongue, practiced speaking, continued practicing. And he talked and talked until he'd corrected his stutter. Modern day stutterers who are people, famous people, Forrest Whitaker, the actor, pictured on the left. On the right, Al Gore had had a stutter. Frequently, this is dealt with when you're in elementary school, and for many people becomes unnoticeable. Most famously right now is Joe Biden, modern day stutter. Had a horrible stutter as a child, got it worked out, but not completely. Today, many Republicans call him Slow Joe because he pauses. And that's a result of a stutter. It's not the result of mental inadequacy. So these frequent pauses that have had many people responding to Biden as being bit on the slow side, isn't he? No, not really. He's a stutterer. There's a fictional character with a lisp, and it's Winthrop Peru in The Music Man. Ron Howard, lower right, as a young boy, today famous as a movie director. He played Winthrop Peru in the movie version of The Music Man. Harold Hill, the music salesman, and there in the lower right you can see the stars of The Music Man and the music that went with it. Whoops. Harold Hill, the music man, claimed that he'd gone to a music school in Gary, Indiana, and he's exposed during the musical play because he said, well, I graduated in 1905. Well, the school wasn't founded till 1906. But in the movie and the Broadway play, when Meredith Willson wrote this, he wrote a song that had very few S sounds in it or Z sounds. So Winthrop Peru could sing this song and get it totally correct due to the lack of S's, etc. So it's, Gary, Indiana, no S's in it. Look at the fifth line down, Gary, Indiana, Gary, Indiana. That's the town that knew me when. And it goes on and on like that with very few S's. Most famous lisp in world history, Daffy Duck, the character from Warner Brothers. I think it's not a Disney, is it? It's Warner Brothers, I think. Personal demeanor, attire. How did Jefferson dress? Oh, I was going to tell you that I just 2 weeks ago went down to Mason City, Iowa, where I grew up till I was 10 years old. My father worked for General Mills and got transferred up here to their corporate headquarters. But my dad played in the violin, and he played during the summer months in a band shell in a park in Mason City. Playing the piccolo in that same band was Meredith Willson. And they would occasionally get a professional musician to come in for a week. A man came into Mason City who played in John Philip Sousa's band. And he sent a telegram to Sousa, said, there's a kid here named Meredith Willson. He plays the piccolo. He is outstanding. You need to do something to hear this guy. And John Philip Sousa wrote back and said, based on your recommendation, hire him. I always tell people that's how Meredith Willson got out of Mason City, Iowa. So a lot of my relatives are buried in Elmwood Cemetery in Mason City, and that's where Meredith Willson had his remains brought back, and he's buried there also. So we went and visited Meredith Willson's grave as well as some of my relatives a couple of weeks ago. Personal attire. Well, good night. Jefferson regularly wore a nightshirt, such as you see here on this dummy, and the famous hat that went with it. But anyway, Jefferson didn't like being dressed, didn't like tighter clothes. So he generally spent all day in a nightshirt. Now, during this period of time, presidents weren't guarded yet. That didn't happen until after the 1901 assassination of McKinley. Also, the White House staff was limited. People could just walk right up to the front door of the White House, knock on the door. Frequently, Jefferson, not a doorman, would answer, and he'd be in a nightshirt. People were shocked. Come to the White House in the early 1800s, and there's the president opening the door in a nightshirt. Physical appearance. Jefferson was 6 feet tall. This was unusually tall for the early 1800s. 5'6" was more average. Some people were 5'8". If today the average height is 6 feet, this is like somebody being 6'4" or 6'6", very noticeable. And Jefferson stood erect, so the full impact of his height made him into a commanding figure. Another thing that got a lot of attention for Jefferson, as it had for all people with this distinction, is red hair. And he also had freckles. So that in addition to his height, he had the red hair and freckles, which were rare and drew a lot of attention, as they still do today. He looked like Howdy Doody, according to many people. Today, of course, Howdy Doody isn't that old. Some people say he looked like Alfred E. Neuman. Alfred E. Neuman has freckles. Mad Magazine, out of publication for many years now. Work habits, intellect. People kept diaries. It was a pretty common thing. They had lots of time. There was no TV to watch, no radio to listen to, no phone calls to make, etc. Travel was not easy. You'd be on horse. You couldn't go very many miles in the course of a day. So lots of people, especially the upper classes, kept diaries. And people would write about famous people that they knew. So there's lots of diary entries about Jefferson in the diaries of his friends. One thing they talk about is he was on the go all the time. Very busy, 15, 16 hours a day. Any moment that he was awake, he was doing something. Some psychologists can measure IQs by people's writings. You know, the IQ test isn't very old. I think 1906, maybe a couple of Frenchmen, Binet, started the IQ tests. Well, how do you tell what a person's IQ is before the IQ test existed and they took one? Well, people say, let's look at their writings and see what they look like. So lots of psychologists have read the writings of famous people in the 17 and 1800s, and from that drawn samples that indicate what their IQ is. Those people that have done IQ measurements based on writings have ranked Jefferson from as low as 160 to as high as 200. 90 to 110 is considered normal. When John F. Kennedy was president, he invited 49 US citizens who had won the Nobel Prize to come to dinner at the White House. And here you can see them. The front row seated, there's 3 women. Otherwise, it's all men. There's actually 4 women. Jacqueline Kennedy's there, but she's not a Nobel Prize winner. So 49 Nobel Prize winners had dinner at the White House. And Kennedy made a speech, and he said, "Never has so much creativity and intelligence been gathered at the White House except when Thomas Jefferson dined alone." Interests. First, some introductory remarks about interests that Jefferson had. Lots of them listed here in red. This is a lengthy section. I probably won't get through it today. We'll continue it next Wednesday. It's a total of 64 slides. But the items that we will begin looking at today include architecture and archaeology, digging up of remains, farming, and he did theoretical farming, you know, what's the best kind of farming to do, etc. Wine, he had an incredible wine collection. Interior design, we'll take a look at the interior of buildings that he designed. He invented a very special chair that we'll talk about. Clocks were another major item in Jefferson's interests. Windows, languages, the natural world, what's it made up of, etc., and interchangeable parts. So interests, architecture. We're going to take a look at architecture first. Jefferson really liked what's called the Neo-Palladian style, or New Palladian. It's named for Andreas Palladio, pictured here. He lived from 1508 to 1580, roughly 72 years. Now, what he did was old Palladian style. We're 300 years and more, or roughly 300 years later, and Jefferson is Neo-Palladian. That's the New Palladian style. And in the early 1800s, late 1700s. Here's some architecture designed by Jefferson. This is one of the buildings on the campus of the University of Virginia, which he founded. It's round, it's domed, it has pillars, it has stairway. It's not handicap accessible, is it? This is his Monticello house. It's not circular, but there is a dome and a hexagonal structure in the middle. You can see pillars, and it's you know, has the quality of mansion, very special windows, looking windows, entryways, etc. Interior design. This is the interior of his Monticello home. The doors, of course, are very large, and you can open up that center section and walk out. But the windows on the left and right of the door, they start at the floor, so you get a much better view than we do today in most places, where windows are installed, you know, 3 feet above the flooring. This gives you a much bigger view. Also, the rounded at the top window. And you can see likes lots of stuff on the walls. And there's a clock there also. We'll talk about that in a bit. Archaeology, another major interest of Jefferson. Amazingly, Jefferson is the father of archaeology. Before Jefferson, people would simply take a shovel, go out into an open area and start digging, hoping to find something, and they would dig randomly. So before Jefferson, it's dig a hole and hope to find something. After Jefferson said, we ought to do this systematically. Let's measure out something, 1 yard by 1 yard. Of course, Jefferson wouldn't have done that. He would have said 1 meter by 1 meter. That was the new French system created in the 1790s that is 10 based. So you got millimeters and centimeters and kilometers, etc. And everything is 10 times greater as you move up the scale. Whereas here in the United States, we're still on a system where there's 12 inches in a foot, not 10 inches. It's not 10 based. A yard is 3 feet. It's not 10 feet, etc. And miles, measuring distances, it's 5,280 feet in a mile, 1,700 yards roughly. It's not a 10 based system. I think we're the only industrialized country left in the world that isn't on the metric system. Canada switched in the 1970s. So this procedure became very well developed. Today, there are huge layouts where archaeological digs are occurring, and they'll put up stakes and strings that outline rectangles or squares that are 1 meter by 1 meter. And then, after an hour of sweeping away dust, you take a photograph of it, which of course wasn't an option that Jefferson had. But today, you just take a picture of the excavation every few minutes, and you've got a record then of what's being discovered and where and at what level, etc. Other interests, farming. Jefferson owned a gigantic amount of property, had slaves working it. Now, at this time in the late 1700s, early 1800s, most farmers grew a single crop. They didn't know about alternating crops, etc. Growing something that takes nitrogen out of the soil, and the next year growing something that puts nitrogen back into the soil, as farmers do today. Here is a graphic that shows 3 images of different crops. That wasn't enough for Jefferson. Jefferson grew on his plantation tobacco, wheat, vegetables, flax, corn. He grew hogs, sheep, cattle, and chicken. So several plant crops and several animal crops. He had about 600 slaves, so he needed a tremendous amount of food just to feed the slaves. It was common in this day, especially with Jefferson, to have 2 meals a day. You'd have a breakfast and you'd have a dinner. So Jefferson here is looking at 1,200 meals a day just to serve the slaves that he owned. So a tremendous amount of the land area that he owned was used to produce enough food for his 600 slaves. Lots of people farming at this time. They were what are called subsistence farmers. They could grow just enough for their own families. Sometimes they might be able to go into a town and sell some items, but most people had gardens in their yards in the small towns and villages that existed. Now today, most farmers grow a crop and sell the whole thing. So at any rate, most of what Jefferson grew on his plantation, Monticello, was food for his slaves. Pictured here is a pond, and it's an artificial pond, and Jefferson designed it. And a large hole was dug and then sealed off with masonry, bricks, sealed it, and you added water to it. And then he kept fish in it. And the fish were for Jefferson, his friends, and his family. And they really liked eels. So there were lots of eels grown in this pond. And that was considered a real high-class food during Jefferson's time. Wine. He loved French wines. He spent 4 years in France, 1785 to 89, under the Articles of Confederation as the U.S. ambassador to France. And he bought up a tremendous amount of wine while he was there, had it shipped back to the U.S. and stored in the basement at Monticello, French wines. Jefferson was in debt most of his life. He died with a tremendous amount of debt. He sold books to the Library of Congress in order to pay off his debt. So he just didn't have the money to maintain a living. He was overspending. And these wine purchases were a tremendous part of that. He spent, I think, about $11,000 on wines. We'll talk more about that later. He wanted to bring these wines back to the United States, but look at this quote. "We could, in the United States, make as great a variety of wines as are made in Europe, not exactly of the same kinds, but doubtless as good. By the time the United States hit California and had hillsides facing an ocean to grow vineyards on, the wines were indeed very good. As a matter of fact, France is considered to have 3 great years out of every 10. The United States, it doesn't have bad years. So the wines grown in California are of very high quality. I wrote a wine book. Here's a picture of it, Basic Guide to Appreciating Wine. It's not about what vineyards to visit and what year is best, that sort of thing. Rather, it's an etiquette book. And wine etiquette is timeless, so this book can go on and on. You want an electronic copy of it? It's out of print, so I don't know, I got 10 copies left maybe. But if you'd like an electronic copy, feel free to write to me, JB, small case, 1717 at comcast.net. Now the next slide has the address on it also, JB1717 at comcast.net. What's in this book? Well, why does a wine glass have a stem such as is pictured on the cover? It has a stem because you're supposed to hold it by the stem. That way your hand is not warming the wine as it would if you held it by the bowl. Also, when you drink it, your hand, if you're holding it by the bowl, is close to your nose and you're smelling perfume, aftershave, soap off of your hand. You're not smelling the wine. Also, you're getting fingerprints on the bowl of a wine. It's nice to hold the wine up and check the clarity of it. Hold it up against a light or a window, something like that. How did wines get their names? What wines go with what foods? Where did wine start? So I got a history of wines section in here. How do you decant wines? What are the different kinds of glassware? There's geography stuff in here. Where are wines grown around the world? Germany, France, Italy. portions of the United States. Minnesota had a huge amount of wines grown all along the Iron Range. Again, very large type at the bottom if you're interested in an electronic copy. jb1717@comcast.net, all small case. Other interests of Jefferson was interior design. Remember these viewmasters from when we were kids? In preparation for this lecture, I looked up viewmasters. They're still for sale. You can still get one. But they were, when I was a kid, they were common. I mean, boy, the number of kids and households that had them. Well, at any rate, they had these circular discs you'd put inside, and then you could look at a series of about a dozen slides or so, and you'd flip the little flipper on the side and it would show you a different image each time you did that. But to our discussion today about Jefferson is, here's a disc on the interiors of Monticello there. Here I've enlarged it. So let's take a look at the Monticello interiors. Large rooms. Most of the furniture kept to the side walls, can be brought out into the open later if you wish. This is the same room we looked at previously, just a different view of it. And there's a statuary there in the very front, you can see it. And there's animal horns hanging on the wall, portraits, so on. Here's another room. This is in the domed area, and you can see that it's a multi-sided room. It's octagonal or hex. I think it's 8-sided. So some of them were hexagonal. Note the furniture is throughout this particular room. And you can see there's a bowl on the table, looks like a couple glasses of milk. Here's a close-up of a little, a room that's off the side of a larger room. Note the round table. Jefferson was a round table guy. You have an elongated table, and somebody's at the head of it. Round table, everybody can see everybody. Nobody is at a point of importance. And the windows, lots of light. You had lots of light coming in. Of course, in the winter, there's be lots of cold coming in. Interests of Jefferson's, the swivel chair. He invented the swivel chair. I'm on one now. See, turn any which way I want. Probably almost everybody owns one, but Jefferson's were quite different. Here you can see there's a base with a platform, and then there's the top, which also has a platform that you sit on. And these two things are mounted on each other, and they have rollers underneath. And here's a picture of Jefferson. Jefferson invented this table also. He'd sit and write at that, and it could store your quills and your ink, and it could store paper, and you'd open up the portion of it, bring it downward, and then you could write on that, and it would slide in and out. And there's a cartoon of Jefferson, legs out, and the indication is he's spinning in his swivel chair. If you sit in a chair at a desk and you want something to your right, you can just swivel to get it. If you're in a stationary chair, it may be much more difficult to get your hand on something. Here's somebody who right now is taking a break. Two components, really. Here's the modern component. You got a pivot pole, and you turn on that pivot pole. Today, the rollers that Jefferson had, the 2 layers of wood with the rollers embedded in the bottom, it's been replaced by a ring, such as what you see here now. And that rests on the bottom and allows you to turn. The rollers that Jefferson used were rollers that had been invented for windows. So you could pull the window up and down. And Jefferson took those rollers and instead placed them in the bottom round piece of wood in the chair, and that's what allowed you then to turn in the chair. Here's a window at Monticello, and you can see, it gets cold in the winter, or there's too much sunlight, it gets too hot. You can close the side awnings and cover the window over. You can also see there's a drape in the this is a kind of a double window up at the top. You can have a drape there, and the basement window below it. This is the original Jefferson swivel chair, high-backed armrests, and 2 rounded pieces of wood mounted together, and they allow you to swivel 360 degrees and keep going. Clocks. Jefferson's, here's a room, and look above the doorway, the window in the middle, and you can see there's a clock. There's an arrow pointing to it. Now, over on the sides, I've got an arrow pointing to, those are cannonballs on a cable. They are the weights that run the clock. And you can see the cable running from the clock over to the side wall and down to where these weights are located. And that's what runs the clock. On the interior, here's a clock. It's got an hour hand and a minute hand, and it's elevated very high. Now, on the outside, the outdoors, the opposite side of the clock is another clock, but it only has an hour hand. So you can see here, it's pushing about 2:30. So this is a 2-faced clock. One face is indoors, one face is outdoors, hour hand only. People out in the field could look and see what time it was. Frequently during the hottest part of the day, slaves were given a 1 to 2 hour rest period, go sit under trees, and that's why you had a clock facing outward. Here is a long view of the outside of this clock, the exterior view. You can see it's located between a couple of pillars and above the doorway. Here's a close-up of the clock weights. And look at those black lines on the back. Each of those black lines represents a day of the week. So Sunday's at the top. Sunday, Monday, it's Tuesday today. That's where the weights are covering that black marker that says Tuesday on it. And this room isn't tall enough to run the clock and let the weights fall far enough. So you cut a hole in the floor and the weights go all the way down into the basement also. Here we are down in the basement, and you can see that says Saturday. It's kind of hard to make out because it's a blurry image, but anyhow, it's time to crank the weights back up. So once a week, usually Saturday afternoon or evening, a slave would go down and crank these weights back up to Sunday. Then you go Sunday, Monday, down to Saturday. There was a gong that would strike the hour, and it was on top of the building of the residence, Monticello. And it was a Chinese gong. And this is an example of it. It's inside a wood structure open to the air. Now, eventually, they became wood structures, but enclosed. So here you've got the gong enclosed. Amazingly, it could be heard 3 miles away. When you've got a 5,000 acre plantation, you need it to be heard for that kind of distance when it strikes the hours. Today, on the right, it's enclosed in a brick structure with windows that open and close. So Jefferson kept making these changes. One of the reasons that he had a lot of debt, this is just one item of where he's changes the structure that encloses the gong, ringing the hour for the clock that he built. So he went from open air wood to enclosed wood to brick. Windows is next. I think there's just one question, so I'm going to continue for a few more minutes. Windows. Lots of different kinds of windows. Jefferson designed many of them. Here's a window, and he's got shelving around it so we can have plants mounted in front of the window. When you're indoors looking out, you can see something blooming, for instance. On the right, you get a very long view of the plantation. Here in the dome, you've got, I believe this is 8-sided. And you can walk around 360 degrees, look out windows, see things in different directions for the entirety of the Monticello plantation area. And there's an interior view looking out. Here are, on the left are some windows, and you can see they've got quite a bit of design work all around them. It's not just a simple window embedded into the wall, but rather has lots of accent material. And on your right, you can see up in the top of the dome, you can walk around up there, look out these very large circular windows and see what's going on in the plantation, or simply view some interesting looking landscape. Floor to ceiling windows in many rooms, such as you see here. My dad liked to gamble. I'd go to Las Vegas with him a couple times a year back in the 1980s. Windows in a lot of the hotel rooms in Las Vegas were floor to ceiling. At night, the whole place was lit up, and during the day, you could see quite some distance. It was really, really nice to be able to have that tall a view. And on the right is a window, sun shining in, casting shadows. And you can see there's not a big pane of glass in these windows, but rather small panes. It was almost impossible to make a piece of glass that was large enough so that you just need a couple sections of glass on this window on the lower right. Instead, you got a dozen or on the bottom, 6 and 16 in that middle section. And they were much easier to manufacture in that size. They survived better the cooling process, so forth. Languages. Let's talk about Jefferson's languages. He knew 6 languages, could speak them very well: French, Greek, German, Italian, Latin, and Spanish. All of them are Southern European languages. They are Romance languages, with the exception of German, which is a Northern European. And it's called an Indo-European language because it came out of India, swept across China, and so it's Indo-European. And English is descended from that Indo-European and Germanic languages. So that it's really Asian origins, the language that I'm speaking right now. Whereas the Romance languages named for Rome are based on Latin, which came out of Italy. Jefferson was also interested in Native American languages. He wasn't sure what to do with them or speaking them and so on, but he would write down a word and then he'd write down the translation of it. And he had a very large chest full of papers that were had written on them it was like a dictionary of Native American words. So he had a tremendous amount of these that he had written down over the years from different Native groups. He was moving all this material once, and the trunk with all the Native American papers in it was stolen. And when the thieves opened it up, they saw there was a bunch of junk. They dumped it in the river. And much of that is lost as a result. Some of these sheets of paper were recovered from the river, but not very many. Today, this would be a great treasure. Here is, in Jefferson's writing, one of the pages that was recovered. And it shows you, the word at the top, sky, and then a native language word for sky: cloud, rain, snow, ice, etc. No backups in those days, unfortunately. He aided Lewis and Clark as they were beginning their expedition through Louisiana Territory to the Pacific Ocean. He went over some of these native words with them. Of course, they'd run into native groups that Jefferson had never talked with, but he thought it might be helpful to them. How are we doing? I have a couple questions. I think, how about if I quit now and we take a look at the questions?
Sure, JB. We've got about 2 questions, so we can go through those too.
Okay,
Um,
I'll talk for a long time with them.
Perfect. The
Okay,
first
let me see.
question,
I'm gonna stop sharing. There we go. Okay.
great. The first question is, are there any modern day Renaissance men?
Oh, yeah, lots of them. They're people in the sciences in particular consider themselves to be Renaissance men. Things things that used to be based on what you thought God would want or was doing or what the Bible said, such as talking about the 4 corners of the earth, making it sound like it's flat, for instance. Men of science today say, well, we believe in reason and we believe in research. We believe we can find things out. If we think it's wrong, we can try to correct it, etc. Those are Renaissance notions, and there's a lot of people in the arts that are considered to be Renaissance people, especially creative writers. They deal a great deal with human relationships and circumstances. They think about questions and opposite questions, and so writers frequently are referred to as Renaissance people. And there are philosophers in particular are probably the group that is in the modern world that are really Renaissance characters. Bertrand Russell, now deceased, was an example often used as a 20th century Renaissance person. He wrote lots of philosophy stuff, very interested in science, an activist. He started a group of people that said we're going to punish war crimes, and this group he started, they tried Lyndon Johnson, for instance, for the Vietnam War. And so yeah, there's that kind of thinking persists. Basically, it's open-mindedness. And we can see a lot of it today, when we say, boy, you can't change that person. They can't give you any decent arguments, so on and so forth. That's really the difference between closed-minded and open-minded. And the Renaissance is about being open-minded. Of course, when the Renaissance occurred, that became dangerous because you were challenging kings and queens and nobility. And today it's, we tolerate that sort of free thinking far more than we did in the 1500s when it was first starting to come out. So I'd say we really live in a long extended period. We're into the 5th and 6th century of more free thinking, Renaissance style. So, yes, there's Renaissance thinking today.
Excellent. And the last question we have right now is, did Jefferson ever earn any money from his interests?
From what?
From his interests.
Oh, I see. Yeah, these interests and a lot of stuff. No, he didn't. He owned a plantation. That's where he made his money. It wasn't as much money as he was able to spend, however. consequently his constant lifelong debt that he had, buying books, buying wines, thinking about things and having them built. And, uh, uh, he said we need a university in Virginia. He was a founder of the University of Virginia and worked on the buildings that were there, the architecture, things he voluntarily did, never got paid for. He didn't set up businesses. Hey, I got a swivel chair here. Let's start making them. Let's make 1,000 of them in the first couple of years. And nope. And that was true. He invented a plow, for instance. Farmers would just scrape at the soil, and he invented a plow that actually turned the soil over. And we'll talk about that this quarter, anyway, for sure. So, no, he spent most of his life overspending the money that he did make, and these inventions of his were things that really aided other people, like the archaeology stuff. He would set up methods, like in natural science, which we haven't talked about yet, but he would set up methods that other people would use. Wasn't the sort of thing you could sell. Sometimes there were indeed objects such as chairs, tables, so on, that he could have been selling, but other people picked up making that stuff, and it really became the stuff he invented that became something that could be manufactured. That pretty much moved to New England out of Virginia. So you had all these New England furniture companies that developed and already existed to some extent. So
I'm wondering if you can, to wrap up, just kind of give our audience a preview of what next week's talk will be focusing on.
Yeah, you'll have to give me a second here. We will talk about the natural world and his involvement there. We're going to talk about interchangeable parts that Jefferson borrowed ideas from different places around the world and made interchangeable parts, and that went nowhere for 60 years. Education and education for all, the notion that not just the nobility should be allowed to read and write, but all people should be allowed to read and write. And we're going to talk about religion. We're going to talk about the major world religions and how Jefferson saw them and what he said about religion. Jefferson rewrote much of the New Testament. We'll talk about that next time, what he did, what he didn't do, so on. The Jefferson Bible has been in continuous print since it came out in the early 1800s. You can buy it on Amazon to this day. We'll talk about church and state, what he wanted, and of course he did not get it, but so on. And then what about the relationship between corporations, businesses, and the state? And what responsibilities do they have to each other? And religion, its effects on politics, and what did Jefferson have to say once he was out of the presidency, knew he wouldn't have any more jobs. He lived for 17 years beyond his presidency. Now he could speak more freely and did, especially about religion. We'll talk about local politics in Virginia and his role in that, and the continental congresses that existed. And he was governor of Virginia. So we'll talk about his political career. We'll talk about the Declaration of Independence and how he wrote that, and then his opposition to the U.S. Constitution, taking no part in it, and so on. How are we doing? Are we out
Excellent.
of time?
We're right at 2:00, so I will go ahead and
Okay.
close us out for today. But thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.